Much, and thank you very much for accommodating my graduating needs of my daughter. I would really be in trouble if I miss my daughter's graduation, so very kind of you to let me anticipate this. And also thank you for this kind invitation. It's for me a pleasure to be back here in Vilnius. Been here the first time when I was working with ECDC in 2006, so it's really a pleasure to see Vilnius again. In the next 20 minutes, I'll try to summarize what is my real personal view, both on LTBI diagnosis, but really on TB prevention. And before we start, there are two disclosures of conflict of interest that I'm going to provide. First of all, I'm currently a QIAGEN employee. QIAGEN is a manufacturer of molecular diagnostics and immunodiagnostic. However, I'm here on a personal capacity, and then the information that I'm providing here today, it's only my opinion. However, there is a huge conflict of interest and bias that I would like to declare. Since I'm giving a TB prevention and latent TB infection diagnosis presentation, I need to declare my bias to the fact that I'm a strong believer that TB elimination is feasible and preventive treatment is severely underutilized. And I developed this belief throughout my professional career, which has been quite hectic. I trained as a pediatrician in the NHS and then moved into tropical medicine. And I was lucky enough to work on TB both at global level in Asia with the World Health Organization, and then very lucky to spend 5 years heading the TB program at the European CDC. After that, I decided to go into the industry and work on new drug development, delamanid, and now into new diagnostic. But throughout my career, really, from a TB control point of view, I've been a strong believer that whatever we were doing, we were missing something. And that missing is TB prevention and addressing latent TB infection. So let me just start with some historical note. Some of you will probably recognize the two photos in black and white up there. The one to the right is Robert Koch, the one to the left is Karel Stiblo. And these two gentlemen have done a lot for public health, in particular for tuberculosis control. We all know what Robert Koch did on 24th of March of well over a century ago. And some of you who are involved in TB know exactly who Karel Stiblo was. He developed the DOS strategy and the idea that by addressing infectious cases, we would be able to curb the TB epidemic. And I think there, despite the fact that we must thank them for what they've done, which is setting the basis for TB control, what they have promoted and we have taken up has probably been not enough. What they promoted, and it was very clear in the speech that Robert Koch gave at in Berlin, in what we now celebrate a World TB Day on 24th of March, he said that the most essential one intending the TB control component, is the sputum of consumptive. What that meant is that all we need to worry about is mere positive cases. And that has been the basis of TB control since really the 1980s, since Karel Stiblo picked up the idea and transformed that in an epidemiological model, saying that if we are able to detect 70% of cases and treat successfully at least 85% of those, we would see a decline of the epidemic. However, historically, there have been more silent voices, and this is one of my heroes, and it's an unsung hero in TB control, because very few of us in TB control know who George Canetti was. George Canetti has been probably, to my knowledge, the only foreign person to lead, well, non-French person to lead the Pasteur Institute. He was originally from Bulgaria. And he was convinced that we would not be able to control and eliminate tuberculosis unless we utilize three key policies for eradication, which are chemotherapy, vaccination, and chemoprophylaxis, or what we nowadays call TB prevention. Why is that so important? I like to bring it down to the basics. I apologize for this slide because some of you might find it patronizing or oversimplified. It's a slide I use with medical students. But to me, it's the core of the concept of TB control. You can look at the TB epidemic from 2 points. The point you see here is what I call the non-dynamic or stationary component of the TB epidemic. You have a large reservoir of uninfected persons, and you have a large reservoir of latently infected individuals. So you have these 2 components which are there in the community but are not interacting with each other, because these are static components in epidemiological terms. But then we have a dynamic component which is stemming out from these 2 groups. We have the reactivation cases, which come from the pool of LTBI, which create new infections in the uninfected pool, and which in turn will create new cases. So you can see here that the TB epidemic is composed of a large, stationary, non-dynamic component and a dynamic component. Traditionally, going back to Steve Lowe and Robert Koch and the DOT strategy, that's what we've done. We have focused on the core dynamic. We have not focused on the large 2 reservoir. We know that has not been enough, and WHO has finally recognized that. This was the first piece of work which I call the flame of the, I wouldn't call it a revolution, but at least of a change in gear in terms of WHO endorsed policy. This was a model put together by Professor Chris Dye and Professor Abu Radad from Cornell University, showing that unless we implement both active and latent TB detection and treatment, we wouldn't be able to curb the epidemic. So just continuing with those would bring us to a standstill in terms of epidemic. So the point that WHO came up is we need a synergy of intervention. Go back to the words of Canetti, exactly the same, 80 years later from what Canetti said. We recognize nowadays that unless we act on both transmission and reactivation pathway, we will not change the face of the TB epidemic. And that has been partly, because there are other reasons, one of the ideas behind the NTB strategy that WHO and the Stop TB Partnership have recently launched. And along with that, they've done something that has never been done before. WHO had never issued guidelines on the management of latent tuberculosis infection. This was released in 2014 at the Union in December, and is now being picked up by countries. WHO recommends the implementation of the guidelines and therefore of TB prevention strategy in all the middle and above income countries with a prevalence, with an incidence below 100 per 100,000. So as you can see here, although the map is quite small, all the Baltic countries, including Lithuania, are included. However, it's not an all or nothing approach. What WHO did, rightly so, is identify the high-risk group, which from a cost-effectiveness point of view, in terms of impact from a public health perspective, would most benefit. And you can see the first group where there is a strong recommendation for implementation of TB prevention are what I call the usual suspect, where the clinical risk is really high. HIV, contacts, anti-TNF-alpha treatment, and the iatrogenic immunocompromised dialysis transplantation silicosis. We have a second group where there's a conditional recommendation, therefore it needs to be evaluated vis-a-vis the country situation, prisoner, healthcare workers, immigrants, of course it will depend which country you're residing in, and environment like homeless person and illicit drug user. And another conditional one which would require at least 2 conditions for the recommendation, which are what we call the large groups of lower risk, like diabetes, alcohol, and tobacco. So that's in terms of indicating the high-risk population. What about the test to use to identify this population that would require TB prevention? And WHO, for the first time, recommends for the country in which the guidelines applies, is either TST or IGRA can be used as a test for latent infection, while for the rest of the world, with an incidence of 100 per 100,000, IGRA are not yet recommended on the basis of cost effectiveness. But of course, in Europe, the first applies. And what I find really useful as I work with several countries in looking out to best maximize cost effectiveness in terms of screening and TB prevention is this algorithm which WHO is strongly promoting of identifying your high-risk group based on epidemiological and clinical risk, and then performing in parallel an immunodiagnostic test, symptom review, and then either not providing preventive treatment or following a chest X-ray. If disease is excluded, then this would be a potential candidate for latent TB treatment. So I think what is really controversial and has been a long debate is from the immunodiagnostic point of view. I'm not going to spend too much time, but I just want to highlight some of the difference and some of the controversies between the skin test and the immunological release assay, such as IGRA test. We all are familiar with TST. Here in Lithuania, you're very familiar. I believe you still have an entry screening in primary school. We are very familiar to the extent that we blindly believe in the skin test, also because, let's be honest, from an epidemiological perspective, we have a wealth of information on PPD. We have, though, a number of limitations. There is a fairly high proportion of false positive with TST due to cross-reactivity with the environmental mycobacteria and with BCG vaccination. There are technical problems in administration and interpretation. I conducted 3 large tuberculosis surveys in Indonesia and in India, and the training, even where we had the best training conducted by KNCB to achieve standardization of intra-reader and inter-reader variability, the best we could achieve was 50 to 60% inter-reader concordance, which is very, very low, particularly in clinical trial. As mentioned, we have difficulty in separating BCG and NTMs, and we have the issue of boosting the immune response, and therefore false positive. Now, IGRAs, people think they are rather more complicated. They are not, because the basis of an interferon gamma release assay is exactly the same of the tuberculin skin test. Whether you do a skin test or whether you do an IGRA, you measure the exact same thing. That is the interaction between an APC, an antigen-presenting cell, which is processing the mycobacteria, and presenting the antigen to an effector T cell. So all you do is measure the interaction between two cells, you measure cell-mediated immunity. The difference lies in the way you measure it. So as you can see here in the skin test, is a very crude measurement because you're measuring indirectly the effect of cytokine release on skin in duration. What you do with any IGRA, so regardless of what the commercial brand, you bring the test in vitro and you go and measure more directly the release of cytokine. So commercially, just for you to know, the WHO guidelines includes 2 tests only, the quantiferon and the T-spot. These are the only 2 that, and including the new version of quantiferon plus, that are stringent regulatory authority approved. But without going into any of the commercial performance, what I want to highlight is the difference with TST, particularly in terms of sensitivity, but more likely of specificity. And I'm using, just for correctness, the systematic review conducted by ECDC in 2011. And as you can see, when it comes to sensitivity, and it's something that often we are misguided, even for sensitivity, the IGRAs perform about 20 percentage points higher than skin tests. While it comes to specificity, it's really important to differentiate which population you're testing. If you're testing a BCG vaccinated population, you can see the specificity difference is huge because what we have in TST is very low specificity when you have a high BCG vaccinated or boosted by TST population. What impact does it have practically? So I ran this small model, a very simplified one, just when I try to see and visualize the impact from implementation point of view when you use a low specificity test versus a high specificity. As you can see that in a population of 1,000, where 900 we assume to be truly uninfected, you would have 126 overdiagnosed with TST, while only 8 with an IGRA test. While the difference in terms of missed infection is not that dramatic. So let me just elaborate some points for conclusion. Whenever I spoke over the past 10 years on the fact that we are not implementing TB prevention sufficiently to curb the TB epidemic, the argument that was put against the expansion of TB prevention was 1/3 of the world population is infected. So there is no point in putting up large and expensive screening and TB prevention programs given the sheer numbers. However, that's a myth for a number of reasons. 1/3 of the population is not infected. 1/3 of the population, based on TST estimate, would have a positive skin test, which is a different thing from being infected. But also, if we go back to the WHO approach, which I really applaud, of rationalizing TB prevention approaches based on risk, you can really set up what I call a sort of pick and mix approach to what the best TB prevention program could be for a country. Some countries, they might just focus on the therapeutical groups, and these are the groups, the one on the top list of WHO, which have a very high risk for reactivation, but the prevalence and the size of the group are rather limited. So what you're doing here from a prevention paradigm is not really preventing TB. You're not trying to impact on TB in the community by providing treatment to solid organ transplant patients. What you're doing, you're preventing the death of the patient and the loss of a very expensive intervention. So what you're doing here in pharmaconomics language, you're preventing an outcome other than TB. If you shift to the right, you go into a more public health-oriented approach to TB prevention, particularly here for elimination and control, groups like migrant contacts. The size, the numbers are big, prevalence could be huge, particularly in migrants, the risk lower, because usually you wouldn't have comorbidity. So if we take a traditional group like migrants, what you'll be doing here, it's really trying to prevent TB. Your cost effectiveness would come not much to preventing TB in the individual, but impacting onto the epidemic in the population. So you go from an individual to a population benefit. So we need to start thinking in those terms. And there is a gradient for implementing TB prevention. We shouldn't be scared by the sheer number, because there is and there can be a gradual approach. And I will conclude with this table taken from Dick Menzies, who is now working at WHO and has been a strong promoter of TB prevention. He makes a paradigm confrontation between hypertension and latent TB infection. And he's saying the medical community has never questioned addressing hypertension and providing very expensive medication to address hypertension as a risk factor, while we've been debated for years TB prevention. Why? If you look at the two diseases, although they are not correlated in terms of one being communicable, the other being a non-communicable disease, they are both a symptomatic condition. Hypertension, if left untreated, can lead to death and major disability. The same with a portion of latent TB, not all of them, but it will be the same with hypertension. Not all hypertension will lead to death. And in addition, untreated LTBI, which develops active TB, can then go into transmission, and therefore you have a public health impact. Treatment in hypertension is lifelong. Treatment in latent TB infection in the US is 9 months, in Europe is usually 6 months. With the new rifampicin, we can take it down to 3 months, once a week, 12 doses. Expensive medication in hypertension, very cheap medication if you use isoniazid, but even rifampicin. Potential serious side effects on both sides, It requires close follow-up and monitoring for antihypertensive, which is lifelong. You only require monitoring usually at the beginning of the therapy, but let's say for 6 months in latent TB infection therapy. So the question is, from a cost-effectiveness point of view, there is probably an equilibrium between the two. But why we're not debating treating hypertension? So if you go to your GP, you are hypertensive, very likely you get on pills. If you got a positive immunodiagnostic, regardless of which one, the debate is huge. We are exceeding from the side of caution in terms of not providing INH or any other preventive treatment. So the question is really why? And the more you move into high burden country, the more this argument is being brought forward. And the speaker that preceded me at just before the lunch break, I got blank now on the surname, my apologies, but had a very good concluding slide on the Article 25 of the human rights. And I think that is a key point, because he also added, and I like to re-emphasize that, of providing the highest standard to patients, regardless of whether they come from a high burden country or they live in a high burden country. I trained as a pediatrician, and if my daughter gets exposed to an active TB case and has got a positive immunodiagnostic test, there is no doubt I will provide preventive treatment. If a child is over 5 years and is born in Indonesia, current guidelines recommend, or let's say do not recommend, preventive treatment. These are over 5. So I feel that is in a contravention of the Article 25 and is a substandard clinical judgment and treatment. So as I promised, I gave you my personal opinion. That is where I stand. I'm happy to take some questions, and I will conclude there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. If there are any questions. Yeah, there is one question. Oh, fantastic, thank you.
Malonu girdėti jūsų gerą pranešimą. Latentinė tuberkuliozė yra labai svarbi ir Lietuvoje. Epidemiologinių tyrimų paskutiniais metais neatlikta, nes tai yra brangus tyrimas. Ne tik tai tuberkulinų, bet jeigu mes naudosim IGRA, imunologinius, yra beprotiškai brangu. Išeitis yra viena – atlikti tuberkulino testus. Kažkur tai, kažkokiam tai rajone. Tuberkuliozės paplitimas, plaučių tuberkuliozės yra gana didelis. Ir todėl yra sudėtinga. Bet IGRA naudojami yra ligonėms, kurie yra gydomi biologiniais vaistais. Bet kartu ir tuberkulino testai atliekami. Dabar dėl imunologinių testų irgi yra įvairių straipsnių ir taip pat jų poveikis priklauso nuo eilės faktorių. Nuo rūkymo, nuo gretutinių susirgymų, nuo amžiaus ir dar kitų. Ir todėl kartais galbūt gali būti iškreipti tyrimai. Jūsų nuomonė, kaip išeiti iš tos situacijos, kai toks IGRA testas yra labai brangus, bet reikšmingas? Ką daryti?
Thank you very much, and very pertinent question. And something I will answer from an individual perspective. I'm not here to discuss the price matter or anything related to IGRA, but I can really comment on it, on my experience being involved in global TB control for the last 14 years, really. The key point here, and that's where we have missed the opportunity, is the moment TB prevention really becomes a public health intervention. I've been lucky enough to work on both sides, the public health with WHO and the CDC and the industry side. There is a very healthy interaction which to me happens naturally in the market. And GeneXpert is a very good example. GeneXpert started at $74. It's now down to, through subsidy, $7 a cartridge, even below that. What I'm trying to say is that if there is a demand that is driven by government through public health need, prices will go down, regardless of the company. And you have the tools to bring those prices down, because you are going to be creator of demand. So that's what I learned. Now, you bring up another very good point, how difficult it is to perform prevalence of infection study, let's call them like that, whether they are tuberculin or IGRA. It's very difficult for a number of reasons. I mean, let's take, even if they were for free, the test, it would still be difficult. First of all, particularly here in the Baltic countries, but I would say most of Eastern Europe, I've done studies in Romania, in Moldova, you have a very high exposure to skin testing. In the past, there has been repeat testing. You're all BCG vaccinated, which is not bad, but when you perform tuberculin survey, you're going to have lots of noise, okay? IGRA could be better because they have a higher specificity, and there is more quality control because it's all lab-driven. However, you have more chances of pre-analytical error, meaning that even before getting in the lab, you can get many things wrong. So standardizing the process is not easy. But I think it's the way forward. They might have even more value than active TB prevalence survey when you move towards elimination. In Lithuania, if I'm not mistaken, you're about 60 per 100,000. So it's a tricky situation because when I worked at ECDC, we developed a model where we felt that all these elimination intervention becomes very cost effective 30 and below, okay? When you're above 30, it's a gray zone. So it's not easy, and I don't think there is an answer of where you should be doing it. But you're doing something right, and you mention it, which is, in my opinion, right, is starting with the clinical risk, which is the top one here. So you're looking at the patient side, not yet the public health. So if someone goes on anti-TNF or goes on dialysis, then you screen with IGRA, you said, and you put them on treatment. That's to save the life of the patient. Gradually, you can then move and expand to lower risk group, which have more of an impact in the society in terms of transmission. So I don't have the answer, but I recognize all your points. And going back on the issue of pricing, which you bring up, and you're absolutely right, remember that you are the one driving it, because if WHO has released the guidelines, so now you have the power to endorse this as a public health intervention, and then you are going to be the one creating the demand.
Thank you.
Thank you.